Welcome back. Okay, so today's explainer is essentially a true crime deep dive into one of the absolute most disturbing mysteries hidden right in the background lore of Lord Dran. We are talking about a story full of intense betrayal, systemic religious corruption, and a literally cold-blooded murder that is going to completely flip how you view one of the game's major factions.
Let's just step directly into the scene of the crime, shall we? Picture the tragic case of Rhea of Thorolund. She's a devout woman on a holy pilgrimage, but suddenly she goes missing, only to be found mysteriously abandoned down in the pitch-black, terrifying depths of the Tomb of Giants. And honestly, if she somehow manages to survive that ordeal and escape back to the surface, she meets an even grimmer fate, an inevitable brutal murder right in front of the altar in the undead parish. So the big question we have to ask is, why on earth would a supposedly holy cleric commit such a heinous act against his own maiden?
Okay, let's dive right into this by looking at our prime suspect, Petrus of Thorolund. When you first arrive at Firelink Shrine, Petrus is actually one of the very first people you meet. He presents himself as this friendly, kinda portly, harmless cleric. He even gifts you a copper coin, just to show his goodwill. And later on, when Rhea and her bodyguards go missing, he acts completely devastated. But, as we're gonna see, underneath that pious, nice guy facade, he is hiding some incredibly dark secrets, quite literally right beneath our feet.
Now, what's really interesting here is that if you go snooping around the elevator shaft at Firelink Shrine, you will uncover a hidden stash. And looking at the inventory, it clearly belongs to Petrus. We've got his signature Morning Star, a talisman, Homeward Bones, and Lloyd's talismans. Basically your standard cleric here, right? But then, completely out of left field, we find 6 cracked red-eye orbs. It is incredibly jarring to find items used exclusively for evil Darkwraith invasions secretly stashed away by a supposedly holy man.
This weird discovery led to a massively popular community theory that you'd see heavily debated on forums like Reddit. Did Petrus kill Rhea for her humanity? The idea was that Petrus was secretly seduced by the dark and the lore of the Darkwraith Covenant, and that he planned to murder the incredibly devout Rhea simply to steal her abundant humanity to fuel his own dark desires. It sounds like a solid motive, right?
Well, actually scratch that whole theory, because that entire supernatural explanation is dramatically debunked by a single number. 7. You see, if you let events play out and Petrus actually succeeds in murdering Rhea in the undead parish, he leaves her corpse behind at the altar. And if you check that corpse, you will find exactly 7 humanities right alongside her pendant. He didn't even bother taking the humanity. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that his motive wasn't some grand supernatural conspiracy. No, it was actually something much more mundane and pathetic. It was pure human malice, cowardice, and envy. We get the real intel from the Golden Knight, Lautrec, who bluntly reveals to us that Petrus is just a cowardly hypocrite. Petrus intentionally abandoned his group deep in the catacombs. He led them into the dark, completely panicked, and fled, just leaving them there to die. When Rhea somehow survives and returns, she's a walking, talking testament to his ultimate cowardice. He kills her out of pure spite, simply to protect his own fragile reputation.
But that brings up a bigger issue. How does a holy disciple become so fundamentally rotten? To truly understand Petrus, we need to zoom out a bit. We have to investigate his cult, the Way of White. We really need to look past this petty, cowardly crime and examine the religion itself to figure out exactly where this toxic behavior originated.
Think about the items these clerics actually carry. Take a look at the description for Lloyd's talisman. It explicitly states that it blocks Estus recovery, and crucially, that Lloyd's cleric knights are widely praised for their undead hunts. That is a huge revelation. It shows us that the Way of White is absolutely not some benevolent, peaceful church. It is a militant regime that actively and violently hunts down the accursed undead.
And we can see this exact same systemic control reflected in the white seance ring. Its description states that the head bishop of the Way of White is the guardian of law and caste and one of the great royals of Thorolund. This proves that Thorolund isn't just a spiritual hub. It is a strict, rigidly hierarchic theocracy that is absolutely obsessed with maintaining social classes and controlling its populace.
Bringing all these pieces together reveals what I like to call the cult of fear. The Way of White actually operates as a highly authoritarian government, where the law is not upheld by faith, but through fear, duels, and violence. Their knights literally live in constant terror of their god's judgment. So when you think about it, Petrus's cowardly, malicious, and hypocritical nature isn't an anomaly at all. It perfectly mirrors the oppressive, fear-based regime that trained him.
Naturally, looking at this brutal system leads us right up to the very top of the chain of command. We have to ask, who exactly is All-Father Lloyd? This is the supposedly divine figure whose face is minted on Thorolund's gold coins. He is the patron deity who presides over this entire brutal system of law and caste.
Let's break down the family tree here, because this is where it gets wild. Look at the stark contrast between these claims. On one side, we have All-Father Lloyd, who is merely an uncle to Lord Gwyn, basically just a collateral relative who self-proclaimed his own leadership. And on the other side, we have Gwyndolin and the Firstborn, who are Gwyn's actual immediate sons and the true inheritors of his power.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive deception at the very heart of the Way of White's foundation. Lloyd is a false god. When the Firstborn was exiled and completely erased from history, and the younger son, Gwyndolin, hid away in shame due to his appearance, Lloyd just saw an opportunity. He stepped right into that power vacuum, proclaimed himself All-Father to a desperate humanity, and ruled unopposed, despite having literally no righteous claim to the title whatsoever.
But as you can imagine, a lie that massive cannot stay hidden forever. If we jump forward into the lore of Dark Souls 3, we see that the clerics of Karim finally exposed Lloyd as the derivative fraud he always was. They openly declared that Lloyd was merely a collateral relative, and that his grand, imposing title of ruling deity was entirely self-proclaimed and unrighteous.
So let's trace exactly how this false god fell from grace, kind of like a giant domino effect. First, Gwyndolin finally emerges from hiding to establish the great city of Irithyll. Armed with his newfound confidence, the Dark Sun takes his rightful place as the true chief deity, the true All-Father. Because of this massive shift in power, the Way of White goes through a major religious reform. And finally, All-Father Lloyd is just cast out and completely forgotten by the very religion he founded.
So, what is Lloyd's lasting legacy after all of this? Honestly, it's incredibly pathetic. All that remains of his grand theocracy are a few lost, delusional worshippers hiding away in the painted world of Ariendel, desperately clinging to lost miracles like the Way of White Corona, that and the brutal talismans that human kings still cruelly use to hunt the undead.
Which brings us full circle to our final verdict. Much like his false god Lloyd, Petrus is a fraud who uses the grand facade of holiness just to mask a pathetic, cowardly nature. Remember that copper coin Petrus gives you at the very beginning of the game to earn your trust? Well, the lore explicitly tells us that those coins have absolutely no value. That completely worthless coin perfectly symbolizes Petrus, All-Father Lloyd, and their entire hypocritical religion.
So, I'll leave you with this. If Lordran's highest, most influential holy order was actually just an oppressive regime built by a derivative fraud, what does holiness truly mean in the world of Dark Souls? It absolutely forces us to actively question every piece of lore and every supposedly holy institution we encounter on our journey. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always look deeper than the surface.